I guess I should start from the beginning. Before any of it happened. It's the only way to make sense of it, or at least to try. My name is Dr. Anla, and I'm a bioacoustician. It's a fancy word, I know. It just means I study the sounds of an environment to understand its health. I record the frogs, the insects, the birds, everything. I listen to the heartbeat of a place. For my postdoc research, I'd landed the perfect gig, a 6-month solo project in a remote corner of the Everglades. The grant had provided for a small, elevated research cabin on the very edge of the preserve. It was perfect, a single room, really, with a small kitchen area, a sturdy desk for my equipment, a cot, and a tiny bathroom. It even had a generator for power and, miraculously, a spotty but usable satellite internet connection. You have to understand, for someone in my line of work, this was heaven. Total isolation, no traffic, no neighbors, no distant sirens. Just the pure, unfiltered symphony of the swamp. I remember standing on the small wooden porch that first evening, just after I'd hauled the last of my gear inside. The air was thick, heavy with humidity and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. It was the smell of life, a rich, primal perfume. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple across the sawgrass plains, and the evening chorus was starting up. A million tiny clicks from insects, the deep, guttural thrum of bullfrogs tuning up for the night, the occasional splash of something unseen moving in the dark water. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a profound calm I hadn't felt in years. This was it. This was where I could finally do my real work, uninterrupted. The first few days were a blur of activity, but it was a good kind of blur. I spent my time setting up my listening posts. This involved wading into the cypress stands, my rubber boots sinking into the dark muck, to strategically place my high-fidelity microphones. I had 4 of them, each connected by shielded cable back to a central recording unit near the cabin. I also set up a couple of motion-activated trail cameras, mostly out of professional habit, pointing them towards game trails I'd identified. I wanted to see what creatures were making the sounds I was recording. Everything was methodical, scientific, controllable. I labeled my cables, geotagged my locations, created spreadsheets. I was building my laboratory, and the walls were the endless wilderness. At night, I'd sit at my desk, the cabin window's dark mirrors reflecting my own tired but happy face, a pair of high-end headphones clamped over my ears. The world would disappear, replaced by the amplified, hyper-real soundscape of the swamp. It was incredible. I could hear the delicate flutter of a moth's wings, the rasp of a beetle's legs on bark, the subtle shift in the croaking of frogs as a predator, maybe a snake, slithered nearby. I was an invisible god, listening to the secret conversations of a world that was usually hidden from human ears. I was collecting data, hours and hours of it, building a baseline. It was routine. It was safe. The first strange thing happened on the 4th night. I was tired. I'd spent the day recalibrating a microphone that had been knocked over, probably by a raccoon, and the heat had been brutal. I was back at my desk, a large mug of coffee next to my laptop, doing a routine check of the previous night's recordings. It was mostly just more of the same beautiful noise. The cicadas buzzed, a barred owl hooted in the distance. It was the audio file from Post 2, the one furthest from the cabin, deep in a grove of cypress trees. I was fast-forwarding through the data, looking for anomalies, when my finger froze on the mouse. I clicked back, played it again at normal speed. There it was. It was faint, almost lost in the wall of natural sound, but it was undeniable. Amidst the chirps and croaks, there was a whistle. It wasn't a bird. I know my birds. This was melodic. It was a simple, 3-note tune, whistled softly, almost pensively. Doo-doo-doot. A short pause. Doo-doo-doot. It lasted for maybe 10 seconds and then it was gone, swallowed back up by the swamp. My first thought, the scientific one, was interference. Some kind of radio wave bleeding into the system. It happened, but it didn't sound like radio static. It had an organic quality, a human quality, like someone was just standing out there in the pitch black, miles from anywhere, whistling to themselves. I shook my head. No, that was ridiculous. I was exhausted. It was an auditory hallucination, my brain playing tricks on me after a long day. Or maybe it was the wind, hitting a broken reed or a hollow piece of wood in just the right way to create a musical tone. That seemed more plausible. I've heard the wind do stranger things. I listened to the segment one more time. Doot. It was so clear, so deliberate. A shiver, completely unwelcome and irrational, traced its way down my spine. This place was supposed to be empty. That was the whole point. I was the only person for miles. Anxiety is not a productive emotion in my field. You have to be logical. You have to eliminate variables. And the most likely variable here was my own fatigue. I made a decision. I highlighted the 10-second clip, took a deep breath, and hit the delete key. It was an outlier. Bad data. Contaminated. Wiping it from the record felt like restoring order. It was a statistical anomaly, and I was getting rid of it. I told myself that, over and over. I finished my coffee and logged off for the night. The cabin, which had felt like a cozy sanctuary just an hour before, now felt thin. The wooden walls didn't seem quite so solid. I went through my nightly ritual. Locked the main door, even though there was no one to lock it against. Checked the latch on the small window over the sink. Everything was secure. Before turning off the main light, I found myself standing by the large window next to my desk. It was a sheet of pure blackness. The porch light was off, and there was no moon. It was a deep, absorbing void, the kind of darkness that feels like a physical presence. I felt my eyes trying to adjust, trying to make out the shapes of the trees I knew were there, but it was useless. It was like looking into a pot of ink. And then I felt it. It wasn't something I saw or heard. It was a feeling, a deep, primal instinct that shot up from the base of my skull. The hair on my arms stood on end. It was the distinct, unshakable sensation of being watched. I felt, with a certainty that defied all logic, that somewhere out there in that suffocating blackness, a pair of eyes was looking right back at me, right through the glass, right into my little box of light. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen for a beat, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was just my mind, I told myself. My imagination running wild after hearing that stupid whistle. I was spooked, that's all. It was the isolation finally getting to me. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, heavy and oppressive. I couldn't stand it. My hand shot out, grabbed the cord for the blinds, and yanked it down with a loud clatter, shutting out the night. I stood there for a long moment in the silence that followed, listening to my own ragged breathing. It was just the wind, I told myself again. Just the dark. Just me, alone. I was wrong. For the next few days, I tried my best to forget about it. It's funny how the human mind works, how it can paper over things that don't fit. The sun would come up, warm and bright, and the night's anxieties would feel, well, foolish. The swamp in the daytime was a different creature altogether. It was all buzzing life and brilliant green, the dark water sparkling under the sun. I'd spend my days working, checking my equipment, cataloging sound files from the daylight hours, and the comforting rhythm of scientific procedure was like a balm. The whistle became what I told myself it was, an anomaly, a ghost in the machine, a product of a tired brain. Bad data, deleted, order restored, and the feeling of being watched? That faded too, under the harsh light of day. I'd leave the blinds open. I'd stand on the porch with my morning coffee and look out into the tree line, trying to intentionally trigger that feeling again, trying to prove to myself how silly it had been. And nothing, just the caw of a crow, the rustle of a lizard in the undergrowth. I was alone, I was safe, I was just a scientist in her lab, and the isolation was a feature, not a bug. By the time a week had passed since the night of the whistle, I had almost entirely convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. It was on the 8th day that I scheduled my trip out to Camera 3. This was one of my motion-activated trail cams, the one I placed furthest from the cabin. It took about a 45-minute hike to get there. The path wasn't really a path, more like a route I had memorized, marked by a specific gnarled cypress tree here, a patch of unusually bright moss there. You had to wear waders, the water was often past your knees, and the air was so thick with humidity you felt like you were drinking it. But I liked the walk. It was a good time to think, to let my mind wander. So I pulled on my boots, grabbed a fresh SD card and a bottle of water, and set off just after lunch. The sun was high and the air was buzzing with insects, a constant, low-level hum that you get used to pretty quick. I remember feeling good, productive. I was thinking about the paper I was going to write, the data patterns I was starting to see in the amphibian calls. I was in my element. I trudged through the muck, the water making a thick, slurping sound with every step. I was following my own faint trail from the last time I'd come out here, a week ago. I saw the cypress tree it was mounted on from about 50 yards out. Everything looked normal, and then, as I got closer, maybe 20 feet away, I stopped. Something was wrong. It took my brain a second to process what I was seeing. The camera was still there, strapped securely to the trunk of the tree about 7 feet up, just as I'd left it. But it was pointed the wrong way. You have to understand, I'm meticulous about this stuff. I had aimed it perfectly to cover a narrow game trail that ran between two large clumps of sawgrass. I'd checked the angle, the field of view, everything. It was for recording deer, raccoons, maybe a bobcat if I was lucky. Now, the lens was pointing directly, perfectly, at the path I was standing on. The path I always used. It had been rotated a full 180 degrees. It was staring right back at me. My first thought was an animal. A big one. Maybe a bear had stood up against the tree and knocked it with its shoulder. But that didn't feel right. The camera hadn't been knocked askew, it hadn't been tilted up or down. It had been rotated on its horizontal axis with what looked like perfect precision, as if someone had loosened the bracket, turned it, and tightened it again. It was aimed. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, the water lapping around my shins. The insect buzz suddenly seemed deafening. I slowly scanned the area, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Okay, Anne, I whispered to myself, think logically. Maybe the strap had slipped. But the strap was heavy-duty nylon, and it was cinched so tight I'd needed a tool to do it. It hadn't slipped. Wind? No chance. The unit was solid, and we hadn't had any storms. So I did the next logical thing. I started looking at the ground. The area around the base of the tree was a mix of dark mud and decaying leaves. It was soft, very soft. You couldn't move through here without leaving a trace. I could see my own boot prints from my approach, clear as day. I walked a slow, deliberate circle around the tree, my eyes glued to the ground. I was looking for anything. The large, sloppy tracks of a bear, the claw marks of a raccoon, hell, even the scuff marks of another person's boots. There was nothing, absolutely nothing except for my own footprints. The air went cold, despite the sweltering heat. It felt like someone had dropped a block of ice into my stomach. Whoever or whatever had turned this camera had done so without leaving a single mark in the soft, wet earth. It was impossible. It was like they had floated up to it, turned it with deliberate care, and then vanished. My hand was shaking a little as I unlatched my small waterproof pack and pulled out the collapsible stool I use. I set it up, climbed on, and reached for the camera. The casing felt normal, no scratches, no damage. I unlatched the waterproof housing. The little green status light was blinking, meaning it was still powered on and operational. I hit the eject button and the SD card popped out with a tiny click. I put the new card in, closed it all up, and then I paused. I looked at the camera, aimed so perfectly at the empty path. I couldn't bring myself to turn it back. Leaving it like this felt wrong, violating, like I was letting them win. So, with a surge of defiance, I loosened the bracket, rotated the camera back to its original position overlooking the game trail, and tightened it with a grunt. I was taking back control. That's what I told myself. The walk back to the cabin was not the same. The 45-minute hike felt like 3 hours. Every splash in the water behind me made me spin around, my heart leaping into my throat. The rustle of sawgrass wasn't just the wind anymore. The call of a bird sounded like a warning. The familiar landmarks of my route now seemed to be hiding something in their shadows. The feeling was back, stronger than ever. That deep, primal certainty that I was being watched. Only now, it wasn't just a feeling. I had proof. Cold, plastic proof that someone had been here, that they knew my roots, and that they were interested not in the animals, but in me. I practically burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me and throwing the deadbolt. My waders were muddy, I was sweating, but I didn't care. I kicked them off and went straight to my desk, my hands fumbling as I plugged the SD card into my laptop. The drive popped up on the screen, DCIM. I clicked it. The folder was full of short video files, just like it should be. The file names were timestamps. I started at the oldest one, from a week ago, right after I'd last checked it. A raccoon, sniffing at the ground. Click. The next file. A doe and her fawn, picking their way carefully down the trail. Beautiful. Click. More raccoons. Click. A possum. I kept clicking through the files, moving forward in time. Day, night, night. It was all perfectly normal. I got to the files from 2 nights ago. Nothing. The files from yesterday morning. A squirrel. Then, a long gap. The next file was from late yesterday afternoon. I held my breath and clicked play. The video showed the game trail, empty. The sun was low, casting long shadows. It played for its usual 30-second duration. Nothing happened. I looked at the timestamp for the next file. There wasn't one. The recording stopped there. The last file was recorded at 4:52 p.m. yesterday. And then, nothing. The camera had recorded nothing for almost a full 24 hours. My blood ran cold. They hadn't just turned the camera. They had done it sometime after 4:52 p.m. yesterday. And they knew how to do it without triggering the motion sensor. Or, and this thought was somehow worse, they had triggered it, and then they had opened the housing and deleted the file of themselves before turning it. They knew how this equipment worked. I leaned back in my chair, the flimsy wood of the cabin walls suddenly feeling like paper. This wasn't some random encounter. This was calculated. The person who did this was smart. They were careful, and they were out there. The scientific part of my brain was desperately trying to cling to some sliver of logic. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned. Maybe the card had corrupted. But I knew in my gut that wasn't it. The perfect rotation, the lack of tracks, the precisely missing footage. This was a message, a quiet, terrifying message that said, I can get to your things. I can move through this place without a trace. I am watching you. The sun began to set, and the same orange and purple hues that had seemed so beautiful a week ago now looked ominous, bleeding across the sky like a wound. The evening chorus of frogs and insects started up, but it wasn't a symphony anymore. It was just noise, a wall of sound that could hide anything. A footstep, a breath. I didn't turn on the main lights. I stayed at my desk, the only light coming from the laptop screen, making my little corner of the room an island in the darkness. I pulled up my audio surveillance feed, the live one, and put on my headphones, cranking up the volume. I was listening for anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Listening for a whistle. For hours I just sat there, frozen. The swamp chattered on, indifferent. My eyes kept flicking to the large, black window next to my desk, the one I had covered so frantically a week ago. The blinds were still down, but I knew what was behind them. A suffocating, absolute blackness. It was almost midnight when I heard it. It wasn't a whistle. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't anything loud or dramatic. It was a tiny, sharp sound. Tap. It came from the window right next to me. A single, distinct tap, like a fingernail lightly striking the glass. I ripped the headphones off my ears, my entire body rigid. Silence. The only sound was the frantic drumming of my own heart and the low hum of the generator outside. I didn't breathe. I just listened, straining my ears against the cacophony of the swamp. Nothing. Was it a branch? An insect hitting the glass? My mind scrambled for an explanation, for anything other than the one that was screaming at me from the rational corner of my brain. It was him. He was right there, standing just on the other side of that thin sheet of glass and vinyl blind, in the dark. I stayed motionless for what felt like an eternity, waiting for another sound, for the handle to turn, for the glass to break. But nothing else happened. There was only the oppressive silence, filled with the knowledge that the wall between me and the night was no longer a barrier. It was a stage, and I wasn't alone anymore. He was here. I didn't move. For how long, I have no idea. Time just sort of stopped. It felt like if I so much as breathed, the entire world would shatter. The tap didn't come again, and that, somehow, was worse. A barrage of taps, a rattling of the window, that's an attack. You can react to that. You can scream, or grab something, or run. But a single, polite, knowing tap? That's not an attack. That's a message. It's a notification. I'm here. I'm just letting you know. The silence that followed was heavy, thick, and full of sound. The unending chorus of the insects outside, the low chug of the generator, the blood thundering in my ears. I sat there, a statue at my desk, my eyes glued to the vinyl blinds covering the window. Behind that thin piece of plastic was the swamp, yes, but that wasn't what I was seeing in my mind's eye. I was seeing a face. A pair of eyes, standing in the suffocating darkness, so close they could reach out and touch the glass again with one finger. My logical brain, what was left of it, tried to fight back. It was a branch, swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel inside. It was a large June bug, a beetle, smacking into the glass on its clumsy flight path. It had to be, but my gut, that deep, primal part of me that had been screaming for over a week now, knew better. Animal or wind or branch, whatever it was, it didn't matter. The barrier was broken. The cabin was no longer a safe zone. It was just a box in the middle of his territory. I stayed like that, frozen, until my legs started to cramp. I don't know when midnight turned into 1, or 1 turned into 2. The laptop screen went dark from inactivity, plunging me into total blackness save for the tiny green power light on my audio interface. The darkness was a physical presence. I felt like I could taste it, this metallic, cold fear in the back of my throat. I didn't dare turn a light on. A light would just make me a better target, a perfect silhouette for anyone looking in. Eventually, sheer exhaustion and the biological need to move forced me to my feet. I did it slowly, like a bomb disposal expert, as if any sudden sound would trigger something. I crept away from the desk, my stockinged feet making no noise on the wood floor. I didn't go to bed. The idea of lying down, of being horizontal and vulnerable, was unthinkable. Instead, I went to the main room and sank into the small, uncomfortable armchair in the corner furthest from any windows. I pulled my knees to my chest and just sat there, wide awake, listening. I listened all night as the swamp screamed and whispered and lived its life, and I prayed I wouldn't hear anything that didn't belong. And for the rest of the night, I didn't. The sun coming up was the strangest feeling. It wasn't a relief, not really. The gray light that slowly seeped through the edges of the blinds didn't feel warm or hopeful, it just felt revealing. It meant the long, tense vigil of the night was over, but it also meant a new kind of dread. The dread of the day. The dread of having to see what the light would show me. I had to go outside. The generator needed gas. It was a chore I did every morning. A simple, mundane task that now felt like stepping into a minefield. I stood at the door for a full 5 minutes, my hand on the deadbolt. My heart was pounding out a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Just be normal, Anne, I told myself. Gas up the generator, make coffee. Don't let him see he's getting to you. But he already knew. Of course he knew. I took a deep breath, turned the lock, and pulled the door open. The morning air was humid and thick, smelling of earth and decay and life. I kept my eyes down at first, just looking at the wooden steps of the porch. And that's when I saw it. Sitting dead center on the top step, right where I would have to walk, was a small, perfectly constructed object. It was a bundle of feathers, the iridescent blue and black of a grackle or a crow, held together at the quills. But they weren't just bunched up. They were braided, woven together with a thin strand of what looked like dried grass into a bizarre little fan shape. It was intricate, it was deliberate. I stared at it, and a cold wave washed over me that had nothing to do with the morning chill. This wasn't a threat, not like a dead animal. This was something else entirely. It felt like a gift. A deeply, profoundly unsettling gift. It was a message that said not only I was here, but I was here, and I sat on your step, and I took my time, and I left this for you. My first instinct was revulsion. I kicked it. My boot sent the little cluster of feathers skittering off the porch and into the damp grass below. The motion was violent, angry. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want its alien familiarity anywhere near me. I stomped down the steps, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the gas can for the generator. Every sound behind me was him. Every rustle in the cypress trees was him. I finished the job in record time, rushed back inside, and slammed the deadbolt home. I watched from the window as the little braid of feathers lay in the grass, a dark, man-made thing in the green of the swamp. Work was impossible that day. I'd sit at my desk, try to pull up a data file, and my eyes would just drift back to the window. Back to the spot in the grass where the thing had landed. By noon, I couldn't stand it anymore. I put my boots on, went out with a plastic bag, picked the thing up without letting it touch my skin, and buried it in the bottom of the trash can. Erased. Gone. But it wasn't gone. It lived in my head now, a testament to the fact that my stalker wasn't just a watcher. He was an admirer, in the most twisted way possible. He was bringing me things. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, my body still thrumming with a low-level anxiety that had become my new baseline. I didn't want to open the door. I wanted to stay in this box and pretend the world didn't exist. But I had to know. After what felt like an hour of internal debate, I went to the door, my stomach in knots. I opened it just a crack at first, peering out. There was something there, again, in the exact same spot on the top step. This time, it was a piece of bone. It was small, maybe the leg bone of a rabbit or a squirrel, about 3 inches long. But it had been cleaned. Not just cleaned, but polished. Scraped and sanded down with something until it was unnervingly smooth, almost like ivory. The ends were rounded, the whole thing looking less like a piece of a carcass and more like a carefully crafted tool or totem. It shone with a dull white gleam in the early morning light. I didn't kick this one. I just stood there in the doorway, a profound sense of despair settling over me. This confirmed it. This wasn't a fluke. This was a pattern, a ritual. This person, this thing out there in the swamp, was leaving me offerings. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned my back against it, sliding down to the floor. The scientific detachment I had clung to for so long was completely gone. This wasn't a case study. This wasn't a mystery to be solved. This was my life, and it was being systematically dismantled by an invisible, methodical presence. I was being courted by a monster. The next 2 days were a blur of paranoia. I kept the doors locked at all times. I only went out to the generator in the brightest part of midday, and I'd scan the entire tree line before taking a single step off the porch. I felt like a caged animal. Every time I sat down at my laptop, I found myself just staring at the live audio feed, listening for anything. The silence was more terrifying than the whistle had ever been. The silence was him waiting. The isolation of the cabin, which I had once cherished for the focus it gave me, had become a pressure cooker. I was trapped in here with my fear, and it was growing with every passing hour. On the third morning after the bone, I woke up with a feeling of absolute certainty. There would be something else. It was part of the routine now. His and mine. I approached the door like a soldier approaching a bomb. My hand was steady this time, not from calm, but from a grim, resigned acceptance. I opened the door. The top step was empty. For a split second, a wild, foolish hope flared in my chest. He'd stopped. He'd gotten bored. He was gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 3 days. My eyes drifted up from the empty step, a smile almost breaking through my fear. And then I saw it. It wasn't on the step. It was on the doorknob. Hanging from the simple, round metal knob by its stem was a single flower. It was a shocking, deep crimson color, its petals velvety and almost black at the edges. I was a biologist. I prided myself on knowing the local flora. I had never seen a flower like this anywhere in the Everglades. It was exotic, alien, and breathtakingly beautiful. And it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen in my life. He hadn't left it on the step. He had walked right up to my door. His fingers had touched the same handle I was touching now. He had been close enough to hear me breathe while I slept. He was letting me know that the space between us was shrinking. Yesterday, it was the porch. Today, it was the door itself. What was it going to be tomorrow? The window? The inside? I felt dizzy, backing away from the door slowly, my eyes locked on that impossible splash of red. This was an escalation, a serious one. He knew my schedule. He knew when I woke up. He knew I would be the one to find it. He was moving from remote observation to direct interaction, and these gifts were his language. Feathers for flight, bone for permanence, a flower for what? Beauty? Possession? My back hit the opposite wall of the small entryway. My gaze dropped from the doorknob to the floor, to the worn core doormat just inside the threshold. And that's when the last piece of my sanity crumbled. I'd been so focused on the porch, on the outside, that I hadn't looked down. I hadn't looked at my own space. But there, right at the edge of the mat, was a dark, wet smear of mud. It must have been from my own boots yesterday afternoon, I thought fleetingly. But no, I always took my boots off on the porch. Always. I knelt down, my entire body trembling. It wasn't just a smear. It had a distinct shape. The curved, heavy tread pattern from the front third of a very large boot. It was still damp. The person who left the flower on my doorknob had stood here. Not on the porch, but right here. 1 foot inside my house. He had been in my house. I stayed there on the floor, kneeling, for a long time. My mind just stopped. It refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The damp, dark brown shape of a boot tread, right there on my doormat. Inside, it wasn't a full print, just the front third, the ball of the foot and the toes, where someone would have put their weight down as they leaned in. Leaned in to place that impossible flower on the doorknob. The world seemed to shrink down to that single, muddy impression. It was the physical proof that broke the last dam of denial in my brain. The whistle, the camera, the gifts on the porch. I had explained them all away, or tried to. It was the wind. It was a prank. It was a weird local custom. It was me being stressed and paranoid. But you can't explain away a muddy boot print inside your locked house. There is no logical, scientific, rational explanation for that. There is only the truth. He had been here, he had opened my door, stepped inside, and then left. A ghost leaving a muddy footprint. A wave of nausea so profound it made my vision tunnel washed over me. I scrambled backwards, away from the door, crab walking on my hands and heels until my back hit the wall of the main room. I couldn't breathe. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the cabin, replaced by something thick and cold. He was in my house. The words just looped in my head. He was in my house. He was in my house while I slept. He was close enough to touch me. And that's when the scientist in me, the part that had been so useless for the past week, finally did something. It wasn't logic, not really. It was something colder. It was the need for data. For irrefutable, undeniable proof that I could hold, that I could show someone, that would make them believe me. Because if I told a park ranger I found a pretty flower on my doorknob and a bit of mud on my mat, they'd tell me to get some sleep. I needed more. I needed his voice. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hyper-focused activity fueled by pure terror. Work was forgotten. The swamp, my research, it all ceased to exist. My world was now the four walls of this cabin and the invisible circle he drew around it. I went to my equipment closet and pulled out a Pelican case. Inside was one of my best audio recorders, a tiny, professional-grade unit with an extremely sensitive microphone. It was designed to pick up the faintest of animal calls from 50 yards away. I checked the battery. Full. I slotted in a fresh memory card. The plan was simple, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever consciously decided to do. I was going to bait a trap. I was going to leave the recorder outside my bedroom window, tucked into the dense foliage of a wax myrtle bush that grew right up against the wall. He was methodical. He was a creature of habit. He circled the cabin. I knew it in my gut, in that primitive part of my brain that was now in full control. I was going to record him circling. I was going to capture his sound. Waiting for dusk was agony. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring out the window, watching the sun bleed out across the tops of the cypress trees. I had a machete, the one I used for clearing thick brush on the trails. It was heavy, with a wickedly sharp, 20-inch blade. I had cleaned and sharpened it, and now it lay on the table next to my hand. It wasn't much of a comfort, but it was solid. It was real. As soon as the light was almost gone, I made my move. I unlocked the door, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt it in my throat. I didn't let myself think. I just moved, out onto the porch, down the steps, and around the side of the cabin. The air was thick and still, pregnant with the evening's chorus of insects that was just beginning to swell. I found the wax myrtle bush. My hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the tiny recorder. I tucked it deep inside the leaves, positioning the small, fuzzy microphone so it pointed along the wall of the cabin. Once it was hidden, I pressed the record button. A tiny red light blinked once, then went dark. It was active. It was listening. Getting back inside and throwing the deadbolt felt like reaching a safe harbor in a hurricane. I leaned against the door, the cool wood a stark contrast to my burning skin. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the monster to walk into it. I didn't even try to sleep. Sleep was an impossible luxury. I turned off all the lights except for a single small lamp in the corner of the main room, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. I couldn't sit near a window. The thought of being silhouetted for him was unbearable. I ended up on the floor, in the corner between the kitchenette and the bathroom, the one spot in the cabin that was completely blind from the outside. I pulled my knees to my chest, the heavy machete laid across my lap. And I listened. The swamp was alive. It was never truly quiet. There was the chirr of crickets, the deep, resonant juggo-rum of bullfrogs, the splash of a fish or a turtle. Usually, I found these sounds soothing, a natural symphony. Tonight, they were a maddening curtain of noise, masking the one sound I was desperate to hear. Was that a twig snapping, or just a beetle falling from a leaf? Was that a soft rustle in the undergrowth, or just the wind? Every sound was him. Every moment of silence was him, holding his breath, listening for me. Hours passed. 1 in the morning. 2. My muscles ached from the cramped position. My eyes burned from staring into the oppressive darkness. I was so tired, so deeply, bone-achingly tired, but adrenaline was a cruel master. It kept me wired, alert, every nerve ending screaming. At some point, I must have started to drift, because a sudden, sharp cry of a night bird nearby made me jolt so violently the machete clattered on the floorboards. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. I froze, my own breathing stopped, listening. Nothing, just the endless, indifferent chorus of the swamp. Morning came not as a relief, but as a ceasefire. The gray, misty light that filtered through the blinds felt like an accusation. The long night was over. It was time to see what it had caught. I waited until the sun was fully up, bright and hot. I needed the light. Prying my stiff limbs from the floor, I went to the door. This was it. Retrieving the recorder felt more dangerous than placing it. I was stepping back into his space. I scanned the tree line for what felt like an eternity before I forced myself down the steps and around the cabin. The recorder was still there, nestled in the leaves, untouched. A small droplet of dew clung to the microphone's windscreen. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I clutched it like a holy relic and hurried back inside, bolting the door behind me. I sat at my desk, the place where I was supposed to be a scientist, a rational human being. I couldn't bring myself to play the audio through the speakers. I couldn't bear the thought of his sounds filling the small cabin. I grabbed my best pair of noise-canceling headphones, the ones I used for editing audio, and plugged them into the recorder. My fingers trembled as I hit the play button. At first, it was just what I expected. The dense soundscape of the Everglades at night. Insects, frogs, the distant hoot of an owl. I fast-forwarded a bit, my thumb hovering over the controls. More of the same. I skipped forward again, and again. For a frantic, hopeful moment, I thought maybe he hadn't come. Maybe I had scared him off when I dropped the machete. Maybe he was gone. Then I heard it. It was subtle, almost lost beneath the chirping of the crickets. A new sound, a soft, sucking sound. The sound of a heavy boot pulling out of wet mud. I stopped playback. My blood ran cold. I rewound it 5 seconds and listened again. There it was. Squelch. Pause. Squelch. It was slow, unhurried, the footsteps of someone with all the time in the world. They were moving along the side of the cabin, getting closer and closer to the hidden microphone. I held my breath, my knuckles white as I gripped the recorder. The footsteps stopped. They stopped right next to the microphone, so close I could hear the faint whisper of coarse fabric brushing against the leaves of the bush. My own heartbeat was a deafening drum in my ears. The silence stretched on for 10, 15, 20 seconds. It was an eternity of pure, distilled dread. I was about to think he had just stopped to listen when the sound came. It wasn't a whistle this time. It was a voice, a whisper, a dry, rasping whisper, like the sound of dry leaves scraping on concrete. And it was so close, so intimately close to the microphone, it felt like it was breathing directly into my ear. La. The sound bypassed my ears and shot straight into the base of my skull. It was my name. He knew my full name. Spoken in a voice that was barely human, a voice that belonged to the mud and the rot and the things that hide in the dark. I ripped the headphones off my head and threw them onto the desk as if they were on fire. A strangled sob tore from my throat and I doubled over, my stomach heaving. I scrambled away from the desk, gagging, the ghost of that whisper still echoing in my head. La. It was real. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the wind. It was a man who was out there, circling my home in the dark, whispering my name. He wasn't some random lunatic. He knew who I was. He was hunting me. Panic, a true, blind, animal panic, finally took hold. I lurched across the room to the small shelf where I kept the emergency equipment. My hands scrabbled for the satellite phone, my one connection to the outside world. My lifeline. I ripped it from its charger, my fingers fumbling with the power button. The screen flickered to life. I shielded it with my hand, my eyes desperately searching the top bar of the screen. My heart sank into a cold, dark pit. No signal. I stared at the 2 words, unblinking. I tried again, turned it off, turned it back on. Nothing, just the calm, damning message, no signal. I stumbled to the window and looked outside. The sky, which had been bright and clear just an hour ago, was now a bruised, churning mass of dark gray clouds. The air had gone heavy and still. A storm was rolling in. A big one, the kind that could knock out communications for days. As if on cue, the first fat drop of rain splattered against the window pane. Then another, and another. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that rattled the window frames. And then, with a soft, final click, the generator outside sputtered and died. The single lamp in the corner went out. The low hum of the refrigerator ceased. Every piece of my modern, controlled world was extinguished in an instant. I was plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness, a gloom so complete it felt solid. The only sounds left were the rising howl of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain against the roof, growing louder and more violent with every passing second. I was alone, I was trapped, and he was out there, in the storm. The blackness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical presence. It was thick, heavy, and it pressed in on all sides, filling my lungs with every ragged breath. I don't know if you've ever been in that kind of darkness, the kind where you can't see your own hand an inch from your face. It's disorienting, the world ceases to exist beyond what you can touch. And the only thing I was touching was the cold, wooden floorboards and the colder steel of the machete handle in my fist. The world had shrunk to this. The floor, the steel, and the sound. The sound of the storm was a living thing. It wasn't just rain, it was a solid wall of water hitting the cabin, a constant, violent roar. The wind shrieked through the cypress trees, a sound like something massive being torn apart, over and over again. And with the generator dead, the silence it left behind was somehow louder than the storm itself. The hum of the fridge, the quiet clock of the microwave, the low buzz of the lamps, all the tiny, artificial noises that tell you you're in a civilized space were gone. I was in a wooden box being tossed about in a black, angry ocean. My mind was a short-circuiting mess. It kept replaying his voice from the recorder. La. That dry, scraping sound was burned into my memory, a permanent scar on my brain. The satellite phone lay useless on the floor beside me. I had tried it 3 more times, jamming my thumb on the power button with a stupid, desperate hope, but the result was always the same. No signal, no signal. Of course there was no signal. The storm had swallowed the world. I was wedged in the corner, the safest place I could think of, the place with the fewest windows. My phone, my last little link, was in my other hand, its screen dark to preserve the battery. It was at 42%. That number felt like a lifeline and a death sentence all at once. 42% of light and connection left in my world. I huddled there for what felt like hours, a statue carved from fear. My whole body ached from being tensed for so long. Every gust of wind that slammed against the cabin walls made me flinch. Every creak of the wood settling was him, on the roof. Every rattle of a window frame was him, testing the latches. He was out there, I knew it, he was out there in the storm, and I was in here, in the dark. And he knew it, too. He knew I was trapped. That's when I heard it. It was so small, so insignificant against the symphony of the hurricane, that I almost missed it. A sound that didn't belong. It was a faint, rhythmic scrape. 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 Coming from the direction of the kitchen window. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was a branch. A big, heavy branch blown against the side of the house, its twigs clawing at the wooden siding. That had to be it. It made sense. It was the only thing that made sense. Scrape. 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 It wasn't a branch. A branch would be random, chaotic, its rhythm dictated by the thrashing of the wind. This was methodical, patient. It was the sound of a fingernail being dragged slowly, deliberately, across a pane of glass. He was trying to get my attention. He was playing with me. A wave of cold bile rose in my throat. I squeezed the machete handle so hard my knuckles burned, and I stayed perfectly, absolutely still. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't let him know you hear him. If he thinks you're asleep, maybe he'll go away. A stupid, childish thought, but it was all I had. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. The storm raged on, but in my little world, there was a new, terrifying quiet. I was counting my own heartbeats, a frantic drum against my ribs. 1, 2, 3. Where had he gone? Was he moving to another window? The door? 10, 11, 12. A sudden, impossible flash of white light filled the cabin, so bright it was blinding. Lightning. It struck somewhere close, and for a single, frozen second, the world outside my window was illuminated in perfect, stark detail. The thrashing trees, the sheeting rain, the muddy ground. And the face. He was right there, at the kitchen window. The lightning had turned him into a ghastly photograph. He was tall, gaunt, his cheap rain poncho plastered to a skeletal frame. His stringy, dark hair was soaked flat against his skull and forehead. But his face, God, his face, it was pressed right up against the glass. The skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, his mouth a thin, bloodless line. And his eyes were the worst part. They were wide, dark, and utterly empty. There was no rage in them, no madness. Nothing, just a hollow, vacant stare, fixed directly on the corner where I was hiding. He had seen me. The light was gone as quickly as it came, plunging me back into absolute blackness, but the afterimage of his face was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. It was there every time I blinked. That calm, predatory emptiness. A soft thump came from the front of the cabin, then a sound that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. A quiet, metallic jiggle. He was trying the doorknob. Not forcing it, not banging on the door, just turning it back and forth, calmly testing the lock. Like a handyman checking his work. Like he had every right to be there. The jiggling stopped, then I heard the soft squelch of his boots in the mud as he moved. He was going along the wall. I heard a muffled thump against the side of the living room window, then the faint squeak of his hand wiping moisture from the glass. He was looking in. He was taking his time. He was walking the perimeter, systematically checking every point of entry. This wasn't a psychopath. A psychopath would be raging, screaming, trying to break the door down. This was something else, something colder. It was the calm, patient methodology of a predator. He was inspecting his trap, making sure the animal inside couldn't get out. That's when the panic, the real, screaming, animal panic, finally broke through my frozen terror. I wasn't prey. I wouldn't just sit here in the dark and wait for him to find a way in. Action. I needed to do something. The door. He had tried the door. I scrambled to my feet, my legs clumsy and weak. The heavy oak worktable I used for sorting samples was my only chance. It weighed a ton. I grabbed one edge, my fingers digging into the wood, and pulled. It didn't budge. Adrenaline surged through me in a hot wave. I let out a choked sob of effort and threw my entire body weight into it. The table's legs screamed in protest as they scraped across the floorboards. The sound was deafening, a blatant announcement of my location and my desperation, but I didn't care. It was the sound of survival. I heaved and pushed, my muscles burning, my lungs gasping for air, until the corner of the table was wedged hard against the front door. It wasn't perfect, but it would take a hell of a lot of force to get past it. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, leaning against the kitchen counter for support. For a moment, I felt a flicker of triumph. I had done something. I had fought back. Then I heard it, a soft tap, 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 on the small, square window on the far side of the cabin. The bathroom window. My heart plummeted into an abyss. Of course, in my panic to block the main door, in my fear of the big windows, I had forgotten the smallest one. And as the sickening realization washed over me, another one followed, even more terrible. The bathroom window didn't have any bars. The Park Service installed them on the main windows for security, but the small, frosted glass bathroom window was deemed too small to be a risk. Too small for a normal person, maybe, but for the gaunt, skeletal frame I had seen in the lightning flash? It was an open door. That was it. That was his way in. He had circled the house, tested everything, and found the one weak point. My barricade was useless. I was just delaying the inevitable. No, I was not going to die in a bathroom. Looking back, I don't know where the next thought came from. The scientist in me was long gone, replaced by something ancient and lizard-brained. It wasn't a plan, it was an instinct. If the weak point was his way in, it had to be my way out. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find in the dark, the solid ceramic lid of the toilet tank. It was heavy, awkward. I turned my back to the wall, took a deep breath, and swung it backward with all my might. The sound of shattering glass was an explosion in the small room, instantly followed by the roar of the wind and a spray of cold rain that soaked me in seconds. I dropped the lid, which hit the floor and cracked. Wasting no time, I ripped a hand towel from the rack, wrapped it around my right hand and forearm, and punched out the remaining shards of glass from the frame. A sharp sting on my wrist told me I wasn't careful enough, but there was no time for pain. I put my hands on the sill and hauled myself up. The frame was tight. It scraped against my ribs, tearing at my shirt. For a horrifying second, I thought I was stuck. Panic flared again, and I kicked my legs wildly, wriggling and clawing my way through the opening like an animal clawing its way out of a burrow. Then I was free. I fell, tumbling out of the window and landing hard in a deep puddle of mud and water. The cold shock of it stole my breath. I was outside. I was in the storm. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented. The wind hit me like a physical blow, trying to knock me over. The rain was blinding, coming down in sheets so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The roar was deafening. Which way to go? There was no path, no light, just a churning chaos of blackness, lashing rain, and the tormented screaming of the wind. I just picked a direction and ran. Away from the cabin, away from the lightless windows and the man who was inside, or about to be inside. I plunged into the tree line, branches whipping at my face, my feet sinking into the treacherous, muddy ground with every step. I fell, got up, fell again, my body screaming in protest, my lungs on fire. I couldn't stop, I couldn't think, I could only run, and then I heard a sound that cut through the roar of the storm, a sound that propelled me forward with a new, sharper terror. It was the crash of a body landing in the mud, right where I had been just seconds before. Followed by the squelch of heavy boots finding purchase in the wet earth. He was out, and he was right behind me. My body wasn't mine anymore. It was just a machine, a thing made of screaming muscles and burning lungs, running on pure, undiluted terror. The world was a smear of black and gray, a violent assault of senses. The whip of wet branches against my face felt like slaps. The thick, sucking mud was a hand grabbing at my ankles, trying to pull me down into the earth with every desperate step. I didn't know where I was going. There was no path, no direction. There was only away from the cabin, away from him. The sound of his pursuit was a physical thing, a pressure at my back. It wasn't frantic, it was a steady, rhythmic squelch of boots in mud, a terrifyingly calm pace. He wasn't sprinting, he was loping, conserving energy. He knew this terrain. I was just a panicked animal thrashing in his backyard. He knew I would tire. He knew I would fall. And I did. My foot caught on a cypress root I never saw. My ankle twisted with a sickening pop of pain and I went down, hard. My face smashed into the mud, the impact driving the air from my lungs in a choked gasp. Cold, gritty water filled my mouth. For a second, I just lay there, the fight completely knocked out of me. The pain in my ankle was a white-hot scream. The roar of the storm was the only sound in the world. This is it, I thought. This is where it ends. Drowning in a puddle in the middle of a hurricane, with a monster a few feet behind me. I tried to push myself up, my arms shaking, but the squelching sound was closer now. So much closer. I rolled over onto my back, a pathetic, desperate move, trying to see him, to face him. I had to face him. And that's when it happened. It wasn't a sound, it was a light, a sudden, blinding beam that cut through the rain and the darkness from somewhere to my left. It was so powerful it turned the rain into a curtain of shimmering diamonds. It swept across the trees, frantic and searching, and then it found me. It pinned me to the ground, a specimen under a microscope. I threw an arm over my eyes, whimpering. The light froze, and in its brilliant, unforgiving glare, I saw him. He was standing not 20 feet away, half crouched. The light had caught him mid-stride. He was frozen, too, one hand raised slightly as if to shield his eyes. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as a lightning flash specter, but as a man. A horribly thin man in a soaked poncho, his dark hair plastered to his skull. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, and his eyes, caught in the beam, were just black holes. There was no shock in them, no fear, just a flicker of annoyance. Like a researcher whose experiment had been interrupted by a janitor turning on the lights. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. He didn't run, he just receded. He took one step back, then another, and the darkness of the swamp simply swallowed him. He melted into the trees and the rain as if he were made of the same substance. One moment he was there, the next he was a ghost. The light belonged to a truck, an old, beat-up Ford F-150 with a park ranger insignia on the door. It was crawling along a narrow, muddy track I hadn't even realized I'd fallen onto. The vehicle lurched to a halt, and the driver's side door flew open. A large man in a ranger's uniform jumped out, his face a mask of disbelief. "Jesus Christ, ma'am, are you all right?" he yelled over the wind. I don't think I answered. I think I just started sobbing. Not quiet tears, but huge, ugly, body-racking sobs of a terror so profound it had finally broken its dam. He ran to me, his boots splashing through the mud, and helped me to my feet. The pain in my ankle was excruciating, and I collapsed against him. "It's okay, I got you, he kept saying, his voice a low, calming rumble. He practically carried me to the truck, opened the passenger door, and helped me inside. The moment the door shut, the roar of the storm was muffled, and the blast of the truck's heater on my soaked skin felt like the most luxurious thing I had ever experienced. The cab smelled of damp earth, old coffee, and safety. I couldn't stop shaking. His name was Dale. He was on a preliminary check for downed trees on the access roads. Pure luck. That's what he called it. He wrapped a thick, coarse blanket around my shoulders while he spoke into his radio, his voice calm and professional, a stark contrast to the gibberish I was babbling. I tried to tell him about the man, the face in the window, the chase. I don't know if any of it made sense. He just kept nodding, saying, "We'll get it all sorted, ma'am. You're safe now, safe." The word felt foreign, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping. The sky was a bruised purple-gray. My cabin, when I saw it from the passenger seat of a sheriff's vehicle, looked exactly the same. Peaceful, mundane. You would never know the absolute horror that had unfolded within and around it just hours before. It felt like a violation. The search started in earnest. They found his footprints, just as I'd said, circling the house. They found the smudge marks on the windows. They found the broken glass of the bathroom window and the muddy puddle where I had landed. It was all real. I wasn't crazy. For hours, teams of deputies and rangers fanned out into the swamp. I sat in a police car, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and a tightly wrapped ankle, feeling disconnected from my own life story. It felt like I was watching a TV show. It couldn't be my reality. It was late in the afternoon when they found it. A deputy came jogging back to the command post, his face grim. They'd found his camp. It was almost a mile deep into the mangrove thicket, in a section of the preserve that was nearly impassable, a place no one ever went. It wasn't a tent. It was a lean-to, a sort of half-dugout, half-shack, camouflaged so expertly with mud and woven vegetation that the search team had walked past it twice. I was asked if I would come identify anything. I refused. I couldn't, but the lead detective, a man named Miller with tired, patient eyes, came to talk to me later, back at the main ranger station. He carried a large, clear evidence bag. "We think we know what was going on, Dr. La," he said, his voice gentle. "It's unusual." He laid the bag on the table in front of me. Inside were several spiral-bound notebooks, their covers warped by the humidity. There were at least a dozen of them. Their pages were filled with a tiny, cramped, disturbingly neat handwriting. "He was a watcher," Miller said. "It seems that's all he did." He carefully opened one of the notebooks with a gloved hand and turned it so I could see. My name was at the top of the page. Subject, NLA, arrival, August 12th, initial observations. My blood ran cold. I stared at the page, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. He had documented everything: the time I woke up, the brand of coffee I drank, a transcript of a phone call I'd had with my sister, parts of it verbatim. My habit of humming when I analyzed data, my frustration when a sample was contaminated. He noted my increased stress levels after the first recording anomaly, my predictable search pattern for the disturbed camera. He wrote about me not like a person, but like an animal in a new enclosure. He was a scientist, a twisted, monstrous reflection of me. "These go back 15 years, Miller said quietly, gesturing to the stack of notebooks. "Every researcher who's ever stayed at that station. Men, women. He has volumes on all of them. Their habits, their schedules, their private conversations he must have overheard. He called them his subjects." The relief I had felt at being rescued was evaporating, replaced by a much deeper, more profound horror. This wasn't a random attack. I wasn't a specific target. I was just the latest specimen. Then Miller pulled out a second, smaller evidence bag. Inside was an old wooden box, like a cigar box. "We found this in the corner of his home," he said. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried moss, were his trophies. A rusty, old-fashioned compass. A pair of eyeglasses, one of the lenses shattered. They were strange, personal items. A collection. Then I saw the last item, and the air left my lungs. It was a university ID card, the plastic yellowed and laminated edges peeling away. The picture was of a young man, barely in his 20s, with a wide, optimistic smile and shaggy brown hair. The name read, Benjamin Carter. Department of Botany. Benjamin Carter? I whispered, the name clawing at a distant memory from my orientation briefing. Miller nodded grimly. He was a graduate student. Stationed here 7 years ago. Went missing one afternoon. They searched for weeks. Found a torn piece of his shirt near a gator nesting ground. He paused. The official report concluded it was an alligator attack. Case closed. I stared at the smiling face on the ID card. He wasn't taken by an alligator. He had been a subject. He was an observation that had reached its conclusion. The compass, the glasses, were they his? Or did this grotesque collection go back even further? The man, I said, my voice a dry rasp. Did you find him? Detective Miller looked away, towards the darkening swamp outside the window. No, he's gone. The tracking dogs lost his scent at a deep water channel a mile from his camp. It's like he just stepped into the water and vanished. There's no sign of him anywhere. I was safe. I was alive, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I hadn't escaped a man. I had escaped a ghost of the Everglades, a predator who wore a human face and wielded a notebook instead of claws. And I was just the one who got away. I looked back at Ben Carter's smiling face in the evidence bag, a trophy from a successful hunt. Out there, somewhere in the vast, indifferent darkness of the swamp, the watcher was waiting. And I had a sickening feeling he was already looking for his next subject.